Good morning, brethren, and welcome to our bi-weekly program entitled The Word in a Glimpse, that is broadcast live on Facebook every Monday and every Wednesday at 8 a.m. West Africa time, which is 7 a.m. GMT. Today is Wednesday, the 5th of October, 2022. And our topic is the continuation of the topic that we started 2 days ago on Monday, the 3rd of October, 2022, and which is entitled, Don't Rely on the Will of Man. Don't rely on the will of man. So today is part 2 of this teaching. We said on Monday that we always have the possibility to obey either the will of God or the will of man. We always have the possibility to rely either on the will of God or on the will of man. We also said that the perfect will of God for us is that we rely on the will of God instead of the will of man. We said that relying on the will of God is likely to make us successful in everything that we do. We also made it clear that relying on the will of man and not on the will of God is likely to make us go from failure to failure or from trouble to trouble. We then visited Jacob's journey to Haran, following the will of man, and we found a series of setbacks that were the consequence of the fact that Jacob relied on the will of man and not on the will of God. We mainly picked 4 major setbacks in the life of Jacob. 4 major setbacks that were respectively, first of all, Jacob marrying Leah instead of Rachel, whom he loved and intended to marry. The second setback was Jacob being ill-treated by his own uncle Laban. The third setback was Jacob marrying an unwavering idol worshiper in the person of Rachel. And the fourth setback was the death of Rachel on their way to Bethlehem. So those were the 4 major setbacks that we picked from the life of Jacob during his journey to the country of Laban, the country of Haran. Now, Jacob relied on the will of man and not on the will of God because he never sought the will of God. Thus, Jacob relied on the will of man instead of relying on the will of God because he didn't know the will of God. You may rely on the will of man in a given situation because you don't know the will of God. Yet, I want to stress on this. The fact that you don't know the will of God in that given situation is not an excuse at all. Not an excuse at all. Because in any given situation, you are bound to seek the will of God. Not doing so, not seeking the will of God, may lead you into trouble. You know, when we read in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 5, we read this. Jeremiah 17:5 says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart departs from the Lord. So relying on the will of man instead of the will of God attracts curse. And curse leads to trouble, of course. Let's now read 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 8 to 13. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 8 to 13. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 8 to 13. Then he waited 7 days. This concerns Saul. Let me read what comes before. As for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Then he waited 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, "Bring your burnt offering and peace offerings here to me." And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. And Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you didn't come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever." You see, you may rely on the will of man because you don't know the will of God, as we said. But you also may rely on the will of man while choosing to disobey the will of God, which you know very well. And this is what Saul did. Saul clearly knew the will of God. He clearly knew that he wasn't entitled to offer any sacrifice or any burnt offering to God. He knew that this was Samuel's job and Samuel's privilege. Moreover, Saul knew that Samuel would come to Gilgal after 7 days of their gathering there, and Samuel would then offer a sacrifice to God. Yet Saul chose to disobey the will of God and to offer a sacrifice to God because of the pressure of the people. He said he was compelled to do so when he saw that the people were scattering from him. So Saul relied on the will of man. Saul let himself be led by the will of man instead of the will of God. As a consequence, Saul lost his kingship. Choosing to be led by the will of man and not by the will of God may make you lose valuable things that God has given you. It may make you lose valuable things that God has blessed you with. Let's always choose to obey the will of God, to rely on the will of God and not on the will of man. When you know the will of God in a given situation, apply that will of God on you. No matter what the people around you may be saying or may be thinking, you just forget about them. Don't care. Just do the will of God. that the majority is not always right. The majority of the people around you may be thinking this or that, which doesn't concern, which doesn't go in line with the will of God for you in that given situation. Don't follow them. So don't follow them. You just do the will of God. Especially, don't accept to be led by crowds. Don't accept to be led by mobs. Let's now read Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. You see, you may rely on the will of men by following the will of your parents, as Jacob did when he followed the will of Rebekah, his mother. You may rely on the will of men by following the will of the crowds or the will of the majority, as Saul did. But you may also rely on the will of men by following your own will when it is conformed to the world view, to the standards of worldly thinking. You see, John the Apostle tells us in 1 John chapter 5, verse 19, that the whole world lies under the sway of Satan. This means that the world's standards, the world's ways of thinking are governed by Satan. And Satan is always trying to pervert the will of God, to make man not obey the will of God, but rather to be led by the will of man himself. That will of man being governed by Satan. And this started in the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, men knew what the will of God was. Men knew that the will of God for men was that men must not eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That was the will of God for man. Yet Satan sneaked his evil will into man's heart. And that evil will of Satan became the will of man in what concerned the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So man knowingly refused to lean on the will of God. He instead leaned on his own will. He leaned on the will of man. The will of God was, don't eat. The will of man was, eat. So Adam and Eve relied on the will of man, and they ate the forbidden fruit. The consequence was as expected. Death came into them. So Adam and Eve attracted death. So there was immediate death, which is the separation with God. And there was also physical death. because man was not meant to die. But now physical death also had come. So refusing to rely on the will of God and relying instead on the will of man is likely to bring spiritual death. It is likely to bring separation between God and man, between the Spirit of God and the Spirit of man. Now, let's read the last consequence in 1 Kings chapter 13. 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 7 to 24. This is rather a very long passage. I think we're not going to read it all because of lack of time. We're just going to pick a few verses. Let's read, for example, verses 7 and 8. Then the king said to the man of God, "Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I will give you a reward." But the man of God said to the king, "If you were to give me half your house, I would not go in with you, nor would I eat bread nor drink water in this place. For so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, You shall not eat bread nor drink water, nor return by the same way you came." But we see later on in verse 18, an old prophet telling him, "I too am a prophet as you are. And an angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord, saying, Bring him back with you to your house, that he may eat bread and drink water." He was lying to him. And verse 23, so it was. Okay, we have gone into a little problem there. The internet was stopped for a while. But we are talking of this story in 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 7 to 24. I urge you to read it. We have less than 2 minutes left, so I will not read it again. So this story is full of lessons, but we only are going to be interested in the fact that the young servant of God, the young man of God, disobeyed the will of God, which he clearly knew. He preferred to do the will of man, the will of the old prophet, that was totally opposed to the will of God. God personally and clearly told the young prophet, "Eat no bread, drink no water, and return not by going the way you came." That was quite clear. It's God himself who told him directly. Now, the young man of God even repeated it many times. And he let everybody, including the king and the old prophet, understand that he would never disobey that will of God. Then came that old prophet, to whom God was probably no more speaking, no longer speaking. He told the young prophet, "An angel spoke to me on behalf of God to tell you to eat bread and drink water in this place and return the way you came." The will of God suffers no contradiction. God cannot at the same time tell you to eat and not to eat. God cannot at the same time to tell you not to go the same way and go the same way. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of a man that he should repent. If God were to change the commandment that he personally commanded you, God would personally talk to you directly. So if God were to change the commandment that he gave that young prophet, that young servant of God, that young man of God, God would personally talk to the young prophet. He wouldn't send an angel to talk to another man, be he a prophet, for that man to talk to him. God would not use two intermediaries to talk to the young prophet, to the young man of God. So if God decides to change what he previously told you, he will use the same channel that he initially used to talk to you. Don't listen to people who pretend to be speaking on behalf of God to make you to do things that are opposed to what God is expecting of you. The young man of God listened to the old prophet and he disobeyed the will of God and he relied on the will of the old prophet. He relied on the will of man and consequently he physically lost his life. So relying on the will of man instead of the will of God can lead to physical death. Dear brethren, we apologize for the technical issues that we encountered during this teaching. God bless you abundantly beyond all your expectations.